When a narcissist comes back after letting you go, most people make the same mistake. They try to understand it as love returning. What it actually is reveals something far more calculated, far more predictable, and far more important to understand before it happens again. There is a fundamental misunderstanding that most people carry about what the discard actually meant to the narcissist who executed it. A misunderstanding that makes the return seem confusing, inexplicable, or potentially significant in ways that its actual nature does not support. The misunderstanding is this: that the discard was an ending. What most people don't realize is that the narcissist rarely experiences a discard as a permanent closure in the way the person being discarded typically does. For the target, the ending carries the specific weight of finality. The relationship that was is now over, and the processing of that ending requires a genuine psychological reckoning with loss. For the narcissist, the discard is more accurately understood as a strategic repositioning, a movement away from a supply source that was no longer providing adequate return toward alternatives that appeared more promising at the time. The option to return was never removed. It was simply suspended. Pay attention to what this reveals about the narcissist's internal relationship to every person they have ever discarded, because it explains a behavioral pattern that most people experience as shocking without understanding as predictable. The narcissist maintains, beneath whatever social performance of finality accompanied the discard, an implicit operational assumption that previous supply sources remain potentially available if circumstances change. This is where the supply shortage trigger reveals its function. The narcissist who suddenly wants someone back after letting them go is not a person who has done the emotional work of recognizing what they lost and genuinely desiring its return. They are a system that has experienced a deficit in the current supply environment and is scanning available alternatives for the most efficient resolution. The returning gesture, however warm, however apparently sincere, however laden with the specific language of missing and regret, is not the output of emotional processing. It is the output of supply economics. Most people miss this warning sign because the return arrives in emotional language, in the words and gestures of a person who appears to be experiencing something genuine. The hidden reason the emotional language is so convincing is that the narcissist has had extensive practice deploying it. And because on some level, some of what they are experiencing may be real in a functional sense, they do want something back. What they want, however, is not who they are presenting to want back. There is a process that runs in the background of every narcissist's post-discard experience that most people never consider. Because from the outside, the narcissist appears to have moved on, appears to be thriving in whatever new arrangement they acquired, appears to have treated the discarded person as easily replaceable. The comparison is running continuously. What most people don't realize is that the narcissist supply assessment doesn't terminate when a new source is acquired. It continues measuring what the new source provides against the benchmarks established by the previous one. And the specific quality of supply that a thoroughly conditioned, long-term source provides, the specific responsiveness, the particular depth of emotional engagement, the specific ways the conditioning shaped the target to respond to the narcissist's needs, is something that a new, unconditioned source rarely matches in the same configuration. The new person provides supply, but they provide it in an unfamiliar form, at an unfamiliar level, shaped by a different psychological profile that hasn't yet been conditioned to the narcissist's specific requirements. The comparison runs, and the comparison keeps returning results that the narcissist's narrative of having upgraded cannot consistently accommodate. Pay attention to what this replacement comparison produces over time, because it builds a retrospective inflation of the discarded person's supply value that has nothing to do with genuine appreciation of who that person was. This is exactly what they want you to believe is love returning. The hidden reason it is actually a supply recalculation becoming visible in behavior is that the specific pull the narcissist feels toward the previous source is not toward a person. It is toward a supply environment that took considerable time and considerable conditioning to optimize, and that the current alternative has not yet replicated. This is where the ego wound of observed progress compounds the replacement comparisons effect. Because while the narcissist is conducting a private reassessment of the discarded source's supply value, they are simultaneously monitoring what that person is doing with their post-discard life. Most people miss this warning sign because the narcissist's monitoring behavior is typically covert, conducted through mutual contacts, social media, or the casual intelligence gathered from shared social environments, rather than through any direct observation that the target would be able to identify and respond to. The hidden reason the observed progress becomes an ego wound is structural. The narcissist's sense of their own superiority in the relationship depended on a specific assumption that the person they discarded needed them more than they needed that person. And a discarded person who visibly thrives, who appears to recover well, who demonstrates through the quality of their post-discard life that the discard affected them less than expected. That person is providing behavioral evidence that the assumption was wrong, and wrong assumptions about superiority in a personality system that depends on superiority for its foundational sense of self do not simply update quietly. They produce a compulsion to correct. There is a motive beneath the narcissist's return that most people never correctly identify, because the return arrives in the language of desire, of missing, of wanting what was lost. And that language points so convincingly toward emotional reconnection that the actual motive operating beneath it remains almost entirely invisible. The actual motive is control reclamation. What most people don't realize is that the narcissist's discomfort in the post-discard period is not primarily the discomfort of missing a person. It is the specific discomfort of a dynamic in which they were the one who left and the other person did not subsequently demonstrate sufficient evidence of having been damaged by the departure. The narcissist's superiority in any relationship narrative requires a specific distribution of suffering, one in which the person who left holds the power and the person who was holds the loss. When the person who is left fails to demonstrate sufficient loss, when they recover, when they move on, when they appear to be functioning not just adequately, but genuinely well, the distribution of power in the narrative does not match the distribution that the discard was supposed to establish. This is the unresolved control that the return is designed to address, not through genuine reconnection, but through the specific act of reestablishing access to someone who appears to have moved beyond the narcissist's influence, because access, even brief and superficial access, reestablishes the control position that the observed recovery was beginning to undermine. Pay attention to what this motive reveals about what the return is actually seeking, because it is not seeking the relationship. It is seeking the disruption of whatever stability the target has developed in the relationship's absence. Most people miss this warning sign because disruption doesn't announce itself as its own objective. It announces itself as desire, as the apparently genuine expression of someone who realizes what they lost and wants it back. This is where the idealization reinstallation reveals its function as the return's primary operational tool. Because the most efficient available method of gaining reaccess to someone who has developed stability in the narcissist's absence is to recreate the specific experience that created the original attachment, the early relationship's warmth, attention, and the compelling quality of being the focused object of someone's apparent admiration. The reinstalled idealization is not the same as the original. The original idealization had a quality of apparent spontaneity. It arose in the context of a new relationship where the performance of discovery was plausible. The reinstallation arrives in the context of a relationship whose history is known to both parties. And that history, unless actively suppressed by the emotional experience of the idealization's reappearance, contains the information that the original idealization, eventually gave way to something categorically different. Most people miss this warning sign because the reinstalled idealization produces a genuine emotional response. The warmth is real. The chemistry that was always present resurfaces. The specific quality of being seen and chosen that the original relationship provided returns with a vividness that the intervening period made unfamiliar. The hidden reason the response feels genuine is that it is responding to something that was always genuinely compelling. The narcissist's capacity to provide a particular kind of focused attention that most relationships never provide at the same intensity. What it is not responding to is evidence that anything about the conditions that ended the original relationship has changed. There is a precision to the timing of the narcissist's return that most people experience as coincidence, as the narcissist somehow sensing the right moment to reappear, arriving at the exact point when the target's defenses might be most accessible and their resolve most susceptible to the specific approach being deployed. It is not coincidence. It is monitoring. What most people don't realize is that the narcissist who discarded someone rarely stopped observing them. Not always actively, not always consciously, but through the continuous low-level surveillance that characterizes the narcissist's relationship with anyone who represented significant supply. The peripheral monitoring of social presence, the intelligence gathered from mutual contacts, the occasional checking that the narcissist would characterize as casual interest, but that serves a very specific operational function. The timing of the return is determined by what this monitoring reveals. The narcissist does not return when they sense the target is strongest, when the target has rebuilt most completely, when their stability appears most solid, when the evidence of their thriving is most visible. They return when the monitoring reveals a vulnerability window, a period of visible stress, a significant life transition, a loss, a loneliness, any circumstance that might have weakened the internal resolve the target developed during the separation. Pay attention to the correlation between the return's timing and what was happening in the target's life at that moment, because the correlation, when examined honestly, is too precise to be explained by coincidence and too specifically targeted to be explained by genuine emotional timing. The narcissist reappears when the target is least fortified, and the monitoring that identified that moment as optimal is itself the evidence that the return was never the spontaneous emotional event it presented itself as. Most people miss this warning sign because the timing feels, from the inside, like fate, like the universe arranging a reunion at the exact moment when it would be most meaningful. The hidden reason it feels this way is that it was arranged, not by fate, not by genuine emotional alignment, but by the specific calculation of a system that was watching for exactly the right window and recognized it when it opened. This is where the false transformation performance arrives, and it is the most sophisticated element of the return sequence, precisely because it addresses the specific content of the target's resistance, rather than simply attempting to overwhelm it. The narcissist who returns after a significant separation almost always arrives with apparent change. Not vague, generic change, but specific, apparently targeted change that addresses the exact issues the target identified as the reasons the relationship was harmful. The specific behavior that caused the most damage is the one the narcissist now claims to have understood and worked through. The specific pattern that the target named as the problem is the one the narcissist now presents as something they have genuinely reckoned with. What most people don't realize is that this specificity is not evidence of genuine transformation. It is evidence of what the monitoring revealed, a detailed understanding of what resistance the target developed during the separation, and what would most efficiently neutralize it. The false transformation is calibrated to the specific objections it needs to overcome. And because it addresses those objections with apparent sincerity and apparent specificity, It produces in the target the specific experience of being finally heard, of having their concerns taken seriously, that the original relationship consistently withheld. Most people miss this warning sign because the experience of being heard, after a relationship in which that experience was so scarce, is among the most powerful emotional responses available to a human being. It activates a relief so profound that it can temporarily override the clear-eyed assessment of whether the change being performed is real or whether it arrived at exactly the moment when its performance would be most strategically effective. The hidden reason, the timing of the apparent transformation, is the most important data point available is structural. Genuine transformation doesn't arrive precisely when it would be most useful to the person claiming it. What arrives precisely when it would be most useful is a performance of transformation. And performances, however convincing, have a consistency problem that genuine change does not. There is a psychological mechanism that the narcissist return reactivates, not through any deliberate deployment, but through the simple fact of their reappearance in a dynamic that was originally built around it, that is more powerful in its effects on the target's attachment system than any specific manipulation tactic the return might involve. It is the intermittent reinforcement pattern. What most people don't realize is that the original relationship's psychological hold was not primarily created by its best moments. It was created by the specific alternation between good moments and bad ones. The pattern of warmth followed by withdrawal, closeness followed by distance, affirmation followed by devaluation. That conditions the attachment system in the same way that unpredictable rewards condition behavior in any context. The return initiates a reactivation of this pattern before any conscious decision about re-engagement has been made. The simple presence of the narcissist, in the context of a relationship that was built around intermittent reinforcement, begins triggering the neurological and psychological responses that the pattern originally installed. Pay attention to what this means for the target's ability to evaluate the return clearly, because the reactivation of the intermittent reinforcement response compromises exactly the kind of clear-eyed pattern-based assessment that accurate evaluation of the return requires. Most people miss this warning sign because the compromised assessment doesn't feel like compromise. It feels like hope, like the specific emotional experience of a door reopening that was closed, an experience so compelling and so specifically targeted to the attachment system's response to reunification that the rational evaluation of whether the door should be reopened gets temporarily overridden by the emotional experience of its opening. This is where the supply reassessment that never includes you reveals the complete picture of what the return was always actually about. While the target is experiencing hope, chemistry, the apparent warmth of someone who finally understands, the narcissist is conducting an assessment, not of the relationship's potential, not of the target's worth as a person, but of the supply environment that re-engagement would create, the level of emotional investment that could be extracted, the quality of attention that would be provided, the degree to which the previous conditioning remains sufficiently intact to make the supply extraction efficient. Most people miss this warning sign because it is invisible. It produces no observable behavior that would distinguish it from genuine emotional engagement. The warmth looks the same. The attention feels the same. The apparent desire for reconnection has the same emotional texture. The hidden reason the assessment is running throughout all of it, beneath all of it, is that it never stopped. Not during the discard, not during the period of separation, not during the return. The narcissist's relationship to every previous supply source is never fully closed. It is simply suspended pending circumstances that might make reopening it operationally favorable. The return is what happens when the circumstances arrived. When you examine the complete architecture of why a narcissist suddenly wants someone back after letting them go, the discard that was never a closure but a strategic repositioning, the supply shortage that triggered the return, by making previously discarded sources relevant again. The replacement comparison that kept running and kept returning in. Sufficient results. The ego wound of observed progress that generated a compulsion to disrupt the stability it detected. The control reclamation motive. That was never about love and always about reestablishing access to someone who appeared to have moved beyond the narcissist's influence. The idealization reinstallation that recreated the original attachment's emotional environment without recreating any of the conditions that would have made a different outcome possible. The timing calculation that monitored for vulnerability windows and deployed the return at the precise moment of maximum susceptibility. The false transformation performance that addressed specific objections with calibrated precision that genuine change never arrives with. The intermittent reinforcement reactivation that compromised clear assessment before any conscious decision about re-engagement had been made. And the supply reassessment that was running continuously beneath every warm gesture and every apparently genuine expression of desire for reconnection. What becomes visible is something that the return, in the moment of its arrival, almost never appears to be. AA system executing a supply recovery operation. The return is not about what you mean to them. It is about what they currently need. And the difference between those two things, invisible in the warmth of the returning gesture, buried beneath the language of regret and desire, is the most important distinction available for understanding exactly what is being offered and why.